All right, good morning. Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for coming on what is a very busy day here on Capitol Hill. I am Joe Neguse, have the privilege of serving as the Assistant Democratic Leader for the House Democratic Caucus and representing the great state of Colorado in the U.S. Congress, and very grateful to be able to be joined today by the leaders here on the stage who have been champions for common sense gun violence prevention. You'll have an opportunity to hear from each one of them. Of course, Chairman Mike Thompson, who has led the charge for common sense gun violence prevention here in the U.S. Congress for the better part of the last 2 decades. Representative Maxwell Frost, one of our young new leaders from the great state of Florida, whose efforts led to the White House creating an Office of Gun Violence Prevention. Representative Robin Kelly, who has been a champion day in, day out from the great city of Chicago for saving lives and has been a thought leader on common sense gun violence prevention for many years. Representative Lucy Macbeth, my sister in service, we served together on the Judiciary Committee, and of course you all know her incredibly compelling personal story and her ability to convert anguish into action here on Capitol Hill. And of course, one of our most distinguished members, a senior member of the Appropriations Committee, former member of the Rules Committee, who represents Southern California here in the U.S. Congress, who's been a leader on gun violence prevention in her community, Representative Torres. Each and every one of them have worked side by side to try to get our colleagues on the other side of the aisle to do something about gun violence. We had great success in the last Congress, thanks to the leaders here, with President Biden's leadership of getting the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act across the finish line. The first time in 2 decades, over 2 decades, that the Congress enacted bipartisan legislation to save lives. But we know that that legislation was the starting point, a first step, not the last step, and that there's much more to do. We stand here today to say we are ready to work with anyone in good faith to address what is clearly a pervasive problem across our country, from Colorado to California, from Florida to Chicago, and everywhere in between. It is unfortunate and, in my view, shameful that House Republicans have refused to join us in these efforts. And if you are curious to know their priorities, one need look no further than the fact that the vast majority of the House Republican Conference is across the street right now, meeting with the former President Trump. And rather than addressing the fundamental issues and challenges that we face as a country, including gun violence, they instead have chosen to spend their time with former President Trump and once again bending the knee to the former president. In my view, it's time for Republicans to join us, to do the right thing, and hope springs eternal that eventually they'll join our efforts. So with that, it's a privilege to be able to introduce, as I said, the chairman of the Gun Violence Prevention Task Force in the U.S. House, and he's done a remarkable job, Chairman Mike Thompson.
Thank you, Leader. I appreciate the invitation to be with some of my favorite people who I respect tremendously for the work that they've done, not only on gun violence prevention, but in general, how hard they work for our country and for the people that we all represent. I don't really care where they are, but I think it's interesting that the guy they were with, I sat in his office when he was first elected to talk about gun violence prevention, and he said, I think we should just take away the guns from everybody who's a problem. Anybody who's dangerous, we should just take away their guns. And he looked at then Senator Dianne Feinstein and said, we should do your bill. And a group of Republicans said, well, there's a due process issue you have to worry about. He said, I don't care about due process. We'll worry about that later. By the time I got back to my office in the Cannon building, his staff had clarified what he really meant to say. And it wasn't anything dealing with gun violence prevention. And that's kind of the attitude and the posture of the people that we're having to work with. This issue is only partisan in the United States Congress, and that's unacceptable. I'm here also as someone who supports the Second Amendment, a gun owner. I've owned guns all my life, a combat veteran who carried firearms in a combat environment. and I have a lot of friends in that same space. None of us think that we should ignore this any further. We all believe that there are things that we can do to make our communities safer that don't violate anybody's right to own a firearm. And this is the 165th day of 2024. We've already had 212 mass shootings. So we have more mass shootings than we have days in the year. Every day, over 100 people in the United States of America die with some sort of firearm involved. Either they are killed by someone using a firearm, they accidentally shoot themselves, or someone accidentally shoots them, or they take their own life. And the people on this stage and the rest of our caucus are working tirelessly to make sure that we can bring about a change. And our colleagues who are down bending the knee, they're not doing anything. They've had one bill that they've passed out of the House this year that has anything at all to do with firearms. And that was a prohibition against the Veterans Administration notifying the NICS system if a veteran or if a military person getting out of the military is a danger to him or herself. 20 veterans a day commit suicide, most often with a firearm, and they're stopping this from being reported. There's a lot more that we can do, and I'm glad I'm on the side of the angels. And with that, I want to introduce one of those angels, a great friend, someone who's worked hand in hand with all of us, and we go back from the beginning of the Gun Violence Prevention Task Force, someone who has raised the issue of day-to-day gun violence in her district and across the country, a great advocate, a great human being, Dr. Robin Kelly.
Thank you, Representative Thompson, for that very kind introduction. I want to thank Leader Neguse for bringing us together. Last week, I introduced the Wear Orange resolution in honor of Hadiya Pendleton. She would have turned 27 years old, but her life was cut short at 15 when she was shot and killed in my district just months before I was sworn in. She was simply playing in the park with a friend. Every time I urge Congress to pass common sense gun safety laws, I remember Hadiya, who should have been safe at a park. But many of my colleagues, as you've heard, across the aisle don't even recognize gun violence as a problem. They talk about freedom, but the disproportionate impact of gun violence on Black and brown communities isn't freedom at all. When you don't want to let your kid play in a park, walk to school, even go to the grocery store. They talk about families, but they don't acknowledge children going to school and never coming back home. They talk about the Second Amendment, but they don't talk about the majority of gun owners like Representative Thompson who support gun safety laws. The toll of gun violence should weigh heavily on all of us. Every year, 43,000 people die from gun violence. Behind each of those deaths are family members, loved ones, co-workers, friends who miss them every day, not to speak of the trauma they all have to deal with. We are here to declare once again, enough is enough. It is beyond time for action. We can pass background checks on every gun sale to ensure that guns don't fall into the hands of dangerous people. We can implement safe storage practices to prevent children from unintentionally shooting their parents' gun. For years, I have worked to stop the illegal trafficking of guns into districts like mine from states with weak gun laws. Since I've been in Congress, Indiana and Wisconsin have made it easier to buy a gun. We must continue to fund community violence intervention efforts to address this crisis holistically and get to the root cause of gun violence. The lives of our children, neighbors, and community members are non-negotiable. Inaction is not an option. Next, it is my privilege to introduce my colleague, my friend, my sister in this fight. I want to introduce Representative Lucy McBath from Georgia's 7th District. Thank you.
Thank you, Robin, and thank you to Assistant Leader Neguse. Thank you so much for gathering so many of us here this morning. I think it's vitally important that we continue to keep this policy agenda on America's radar. And you are a treasured friend from my freshman class, and I thank you for all that you continue to do to advance policies to protect Colorado, your own state, but also our country. And I'm glad to be with my friends, each and every one of them, fellow fighters in our gun violence prevention movement here in Congress on the Hill. In the 5 years since I've come to Congress, the House Democratic Caucus has truly become the Gun Safety Caucus. We truly are the new gun lobby. And it gives me hope because I never ever thought that I personally would be here in Congress, let alone living out my own son's legacy as we pass bills to stop any more families from feeling the pain of losing a child or a loved one to unnecessary gun violence, as I have and so many people around the country do every single day. It is a testament to leaders like our Gun Violence Prevention Task Force Chairman, Mr. Mike Thompson from California, that we are able to continue to celebrate these monumental accomplishments and remarkable change that is made in this country over the last few years. Our leaders like Robin Kelly, my sister in service, who is a fearless voice for Chicago and for this country. And she never lets us forget about the everyday gun violence that happens in communities, not only in the city of Chicago, but all over this nation. All the individuals, children, aunts and uncles and loved ones that continue to die every single day, and no one knows their names outside of the families that lose them and the communities that love them. Because we know that gun violence doesn't care what political affiliation you are, or it doesn't care where you live. And I'm so grateful to stand beside these gun sense champions every single day. And Norma Torres, who has heard firsthand the terrified 911 calls of those crying out for help and has been a tireless champion for gun violence prevention policies to keep all of our communities safe. And Maxwell Frost, who to me is truly the embodiment of the need for change felt by students who have stood up across this country and asked America to do better by them. Asked the adults in this country to make sure that they have the ability to live freely, unfettered by unnecessary gun violence. He is leading the charge in the change felt by students who are standing up every single day. And after terror and pain, he himself came to this hill, came to Washington, as a lot of his classmates that lost their lives were stolen from them. He's come to organize others and to ultimately become a member of Congress himself on this issue to make sure that no one else loses their life. As a mother, forever, it fills me with hope to see so many of those in my son's generation like him that are standing up to join this movement. As you can see, we represent every cross-section of this country, and we're all coming together to make our future brighter and safer for our future generations. This month, we are marking 2 years of the most monumental gun safety reform that this country has seen in decades, led by our gun sense House Democratic Caucus and President Biden. With parts of my red flag bill, with community intervention funding, and with mental health resources for all 50 states, solutions that the American people have been crying out for overwhelmingly. They continue to cry out for common sense legislation to save lives, to save their lives. And we're building on that monumental progress with the introduction of my bipartisan Go Safe act to keep weapons of war off of our streets. But each and every one of my colleagues has introduced legislation that is truly making a difference. With the introduction of new legislation and movement forward on discharge petitions that we are putting on the floor to force votes on these important bills, to force our Republican colleagues to address what's happening in their very own communities and their very own states. We, the Gun Sense Democratic Caucus, are working to protect every American, no matter what your political affiliation is. Even if the current majority doesn't want to stand up for the safety of their own constituents and their own families, I promise you, we will. I'm so grateful to each and every one on the stage and all of my colleagues for all the phenomenal work that they do every single day. And as a survivor, having lost my own child, I cannot tell you how important it is to have their support. And now it is my complete pleasure to bring up to you an incredible voice in our caucus, Congresswoman Norma Torres from California.
Thank you so much, Lucy. You truly are a leader on this very tragic issue that not a single one of us has not had to deal with. And thank you to our minority leader, Joe Neguse, for bringing us together and to be able to talk about an epidemic that has shed the blood of so many of our loved ones. This is an issue that ties us together through tragedy. As a former 911 dispatcher, one hot summer night, I answered a call of an 11-year-old girl. The only thing that I could hear were her screams, horrible screams, followed by thumping, extremely loud, violent thumping, followed by 5 gunshots. That as a 911 dispatcher, I had to count every single one of them as they exploded in my ears. I knew somebody was injured, and we dispatched the police and the fire department. What I didn't know was that I would end up at the Hollywood Division in Los Angeles in a little tiny detective room translating that 911 call. And what I thought were screams were not screams. Uncle, please don't kill me. It is not my fault. They were the words of an 11-year-old girl who was innocent in this love triangle, that after this person had one alcoholic beverage, one beer, he was found too intoxicated to know better, too intoxicated to understand that the thumping that I was hearing was her head being bashed on the wall, that he had shot off his thumb when he was holding her by the hair while shooting her point blank with a 9mm. Why did this unstable person have a handgun? As a mayor of my home city of Pomona, a 3-year-old baby was having a birthday party with jumper in front of his house and a cake and several other toddlers celebrating his birthday. He was murdered, he was gunned down, he was shot in front of his home by someone who meant to shoot someone else who was supposed to be at the party but wasn't. As a mayor of my home city, I had to bury a police officer who was shot in front of our courthouse. in a gang initiation by a 15-year-old boy who had been jumped into a gang and was ordered to kill an officer. These stories go on and on and on, not just for me as a member of Congress, but also for many of you. America is not safe until we pass all of these bills that my colleagues have introduced, including my own bill. If you buy multiple handguns, those are reported to the DOJ. But if you go out and buy multiple long guns, those are not reported to the DOJ. This is the unjust legislature that we are serving in. This is the unjust Congress that fails to see that when the Second Amendment was drafted, it didn't say every single life in America could be and should be compromised because the Second Amendment is more important than that. It is unfair that we are teaching our children to hide from an active shooter. When I grew up, I was trained to deal with earthquakes. My grandchildren are learning to hide from active shooters. This is not the America that we want to live in. And I hope that our communities who are being represented by the very people that stand in the way of sensible gun legislation will stand up and communicate their wishes to their members of Congress, because we must change and we must pass these bills. You know, we have a lot of expertise behind us on gun violence, from some very senior members to a junior member who has surpassed so many different challenges. And I am so proud to stand here and share the stage with my colleague, Maxwell Frost from Florida 10.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for being here today, and thank you so much to the Assistant Leader Neguse for putting this together. My mom's in D.C. this week, and she just retired a few months ago as a public school educator of 37 years. She taught special education for all 37 years. But she's busier now more than ever because she's a Moms Demand Action volunteer. I'll go to events all across my district, and I see her there, and I'm like, Mom, did you come to see me? And she's like, well, I'm here at Moms Demand Action. She's up here for a lobby day, and she's staying at my place last night and tonight. And we were talking yesterday over dinner about some of the meetings she had. And she said, on my slate, I met exclusively with Republicans and with Republican staffers. And she said, I felt like I wasted my time. I said, why? Why'd you feel that way? Your story is important. The survivors you were with, their stories are important. Why'd you feel like you wasted your time? And she said, well, I felt like there was absolutely zero emotion in the person I was speaking with. And I completely understood what she was saying because I've had countless of these meetings, whether it's in Tallahassee in Florida or up here in Congress. In fact, I remember one of them right after a shooting. I met with a legislator. He cried with our families, actually, hugged folks, said he would do something, and the next day there was a floor vote on universal background checks, and he voted the same way he's always voted. I think the interesting thing is most Americans want gun violence prevention legislation passed. 90% of this country, over 90% of this country, wants universal background checks. So it's bipartisan and there's consensus around the country, but when we walk into these halls, the term bipartisanship and consensus takes a different definition. And the definition it takes is what the NRA and the gun lobby allows to be passed. and it's a damn shame. You know, yesterday was the 8-year remembrance of when a gunman walked into Pulse nightclub in my district in Orlando, Florida, and murdered 49 people because they were queer. Murdered 49 people because they were people of color. That armed bigotry and hate was allowed to be armed by the government of the United States of America because we don't have the right laws in place to prevent people like that from getting the guns that they get. Yesterday we had a moment of silence. No Republicans joined. I'm actually happy no Republicans joined, because if one joined, I would have walked off the House floor, because I refuse to stand. You'll never see me stand in a moment of silence for a victim of gun violence with someone who won't vote to end it. I'll never do that. Because when I walk through these halls, I'm walking with Joaquin, I'm walking with Guac, who died in Parkland in a pool of his own blood. I'm walking with Jamie Guttenberg, who died in Parkland in her own blood. I'm walking with Jordan. I'm walking with Breonna Taylor. I'm walking with Tiana Major, who was a 9-year-old who was shot to death in my district just last year, sitting on her bed in her own home. But despite all of that, I do feel like for the first time, the gun violence prevention movement is stronger than the gun lobby. That's why the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act was passed. That's why we're seeing groundbreaking executive orders come from the White House. That's why we have the Office of Gun Violence Prevention. But when I say that I think the gun violence prevention movement is stronger than the gun lobby, a lot of people say, well, why haven't you gotten everything done? Well, you got to study movement. We have the power now, but it's about sustained power. You don't get everything you want at once, but when you sustain it for a long period of time, we're going to look back after we've passed this legislation and say, we did this because of people power and because of the people on this stage. So we're going to keep fighting. I trust in hopefully a majority will be able to pass the legislation that we need, and create a world where the leading cause of death for our children and teens isn't to be shot. That's the future I want. That's the freedom I want for our people. Thank you.